The story of Brant, Two Scoops. Daniel begins not with a single crime, but inside a system designed to harden men into weapons. California's maximum security prisons are not merely places of confinement. They are closed ecosystems where power is currency, survival is negotiated daily, and violence is often the only language that carries weight. Within these walls, prison gangs operate as governments unto themselves, enforcing rules more rigid than any statute book. Among the most feared of these groups stands the Aryan Brotherhood, an organization whose reputation has been built over decades through intimidation, murder, and absolute internal discipline. For inmates entering this world, neutrality is rarely an option. Race-based politics dominate housing, movement, and survival. Protection comes at a cost, and that cost is loyalty. For the Aryan Brotherhood, loyalty is not symbolic. It is proven through action, often violent, sometimes fatal. To be validated as a member is to accept that orders are not suggestions, and refusal can be a death sentence. By at least 2013, Brandt Daniel had crossed that threshold. He was validated as an Aryan Brotherhood member, formally tying his fate to one of the most powerful prison gangs in the United States. Validation is not a ceremonial label. It is a designation earned through conduct, associations, and compliance. Once validated, an inmate is expected to live by the gang's code, a strict hierarchy enforced by senior members and generals who issue commands from within the prison system itself. These orders, often referred to as directives, are carried out without question. The gang's survival depends on obedience, and its authority is maintained through calculated acts of violence designed to send messages, both to enemies and to its own ranks. Daniel's rise within this structure did not happen in isolation. The Aryan Brotherhood thrives in environments where fear and instability are constant. Prison yards become battlegrounds where alliances shift and rivalries simmer beneath the surface. In this world, reputation is everything. An inmate known for hesitation or weakness becomes a liability. Conversely, those willing to enforce the gang's will gain trust, status, and protection. Over time, Daniel came to be seen not merely as a participant, but as an enforcer, someone capable of carrying out the most serious orders when the gang's authority was challenged. Nicknames in prison are rarely accidental. They are earned through behavior, personality, or infamy. Two Scoops was a name that followed Daniel through the system, a marker of identity in an environment where identity is often stripped away. Names carry weight behind bars, and recognition can be both armor and target. For Aryan Brotherhood members, being known can elevate status, but it also brings expectations. Once an inmate is trusted to enforce discipline, failure is no longer tolerated. The Aryan Brotherhood's internal justice system is unforgiving. Members who disobey orders, fail to carry out assignments, or attract unwanted attention from authorities are seen as threats to the organization. Punishment is not left to chance. It is deliberate, violent, and public enough to deter others from following the same path. Status killings, murders carried out to enforce discipline or maintain rank, are a defining feature of the gang's operations. They are not crimes of passion, but acts of governance. By the mid-2000s, California prison officials and federal investigators were increasingly aware that the Aryan Brotherhood was not simply reacting to prison life, but actively directing criminal activity from within. Murders, assaults, and drug trafficking operations were coordinated through coded messages, trusted intermediaries, and a chain of command that extended far beyond individual institutions. In this environment, enforcers like Daniel played a critical role. They were the hands that turned orders into reality. Life inside a high-security prison amplifies every decision. There are no witnesses who are truly neutral, no guards who see everything, and no safe places to hide from the consequences of disobedience. For Aryan Brotherhood members, the pressure to perform is constant. Every interaction is measured, every movement observed. Trust is conditional and can be revoked instantly. To maintain standing, members must demonstrate commitment repeatedly, often through acts that permanently define their criminal legacy. As Daniel's reputation grew, so did the stakes surrounding him. Being known as someone willing to act on behalf of the gang brought a certain level of protection, but it also bound him tighter to the Brotherhood's demands. In this system, there is no retirement and no opting out. Once validated and active, an inmate's choices narrow until violence becomes not just expected, but inevitable. The path Daniel was on pointed toward a moment when his loyalty would be tested in the most extreme way possible. The gang's rules are clear. Failure is punishable by death. Status must be maintained at all costs. Inside Salinas Valley State Prison, tensions were building, orders were circulating, and the Aryan Brotherhood was watching its own. For Brant, 2 scoops. Daniel, the role of enforcer, was no longer theoretical. The next act would transform him from a validated member into a convicted murderer, carrying out a killing not for personal gain, but to satisfy the ruthless logic of the gang he served. Salinas Valley State Prison is a facility built for control, yet it has long been known as a pressure cooker where gang politics routinely erupt into violence. Housing some of California's most dangerous inmates, the prison operates under an unspoken reality. While officers maintain order on paper, real power on the yards often rests with the gangs. For the Aryan Brotherhood, Salinas Valley was not just another institution, it was territory. Decisions made inside its walls could ripple through the entire state prison system. Within this environment, assignments were issued quietly, and expectations were understood without explanation. Aryan Brotherhood members were required to carry out directives as proof of loyalty. When those directives were ignored or botched, the consequences were severe. By 2016, one such failure had drawn the attention of the gang's leadership. Zachary Scott, a fellow inmate, had reportedly been ordered to carry out a hit on behalf of the Aryan Brotherhood. He did not follow through. In the logic of the gang, this was not merely disobedience, it was a threat to the organization's authority. Failure to act creates vulnerability inside a prison gang. It signals weakness, invites dissent, and undermines the fear that keeps others in line. For the Aryan Brotherhood, allowing a member to ignore an order without consequence would send the wrong message. Discipline had to be restored, and restoration required blood. The responsibility for enforcing that discipline fell to someone trusted, someone whose loyalty was already established. That person, according to court records, was Brandt 2 Scoops Daniel. On October 29, 2016, the logic of prison gang governance reached its inevitable conclusion. Inside Salinas Valley State Prison, Daniel attacked and killed Zachary Scott. The murder was not spontaneous, nor was it personal in the conventional sense. Prosecutors would later argue, and courts would agree, that the killing was carried out to maintain Daniel's status within the Aryan Brotherhood, and to punish Scott for his failure to carry out a gang-sanctioned murder. It was an execution framed as internal justice. Murders inside prison walls are designed to communicate. They tell rivals that the gang is disciplined and unafraid. They tell members that orders are absolute. And they tell the institution itself that control is contested. The killing of Scott served all 3 purposes. It reinforced the Aryan Brotherhood's authority, eliminated a perceived liability, and elevated Daniel's standing as someone willing to do what others would not. Investigations into prison homicides often face obstacles that do not exist on the outside. Witnesses are reluctant or terrified. Evidence is limited, and silence is enforced through fear of retaliation. Even so, the circumstances surrounding Scott's death quickly drew scrutiny. The motive was clear within the context of prison gang politics, and Daniel's role became central to the case. What may have been intended as an internal disciplinary act soon became the foundation of a criminal prosecution. In 2017, Daniel was convicted in state court for the murder of Zachary Scott. The verdict carried life sentences, cementing his identity not just as a gang member, but as a convicted killer. For the Aryan Brotherhood, the outcome was mixed. The gang's rules had been enforced, but the state had also asserted its authority, pulling one of the Brotherhood's enforcers deeper into the spotlight. Conviction did not remove Daniel from the gang's orbit. Life sentences inside California's prison system often mean decades of continued involvement in gang politics. In many cases, incarceration only deepens an inmate's importance within criminal networks. Those serving long terms have little to lose and significant influence to gain. From behind bars, they become stabilizing figures, repositories of experience, reputation, and connections. The murder at Salinas Valley would later be seen not as an isolated act, but as part of a broader pattern of violence orchestrated by the Aryan Brotherhood. Investigators were beginning to connect the dots between individual killings and a centralized command structure operating across multiple prisons. Daniel's conviction placed him firmly within that narrative. He was no longer just enforcing orders. He had become evidence of how those orders were carried out. As Daniel entered the next phase of his incarceration, the consequences of the Scott murder continued to unfold. The killing had secured his status within the gang, but it had also drawn federal attention. What began as a prison yard execution would soon intersect with a sweeping federal investigation aimed at dismantling the Aryan Brotherhood's leadership itself. The act that proved Daniel's loyalty would also set the stage for the most serious legal battle of his life. By the late 2000s, federal authorities had reached a conclusion that California's prison system alone could no longer ignore. The Aryan Brotherhood was not merely a violent prison gang reacting to its environment, but a coordinated criminal enterprise directing serious crimes from behind bars. Murders, assaults, and drug trafficking operations were being ordered, approved, and enforced by inmates serving long sentences, many of whom had little fear of additional punishment. The prison walls that were meant to contain them had instead become command centers. Federal investigators began assembling cases that treated the Aryan Brotherhood not as a loose association, but as an organized racketeering operation. Using wiretaps, confidential informants, prison communications, and years of incident reports, prosecutors mapped out a structure that mirrored traditional organized crime families. Orders flowed downward, discipline flowed upward. Violence was the currency that kept the system intact. In 2019, that investigation culminated in a sweeping federal indictment. More than a dozen Aryan Brotherhood members were charged with crimes ranging from drug trafficking to murder, all under federal racketeering statutes. The case alleged that senior members orchestrated killings from inside California prisons, using trusted enforcers to carry out executions designed to maintain control and eliminate perceived threats. It was one of the most significant federal actions ever taken against the gang. Brant, 2 scoops. Daniel emerged as a central defendant in the case. Prosecutors did not view him as a peripheral player or a follower who acted on impulse. Instead, they portrayed him as a key instrument of the gang's enforcement arm, someone who translated leadership directives into irreversible action. The murder of Zachary Scott was no longer treated as an isolated prison homicide. It was reframed as murder in aid of racketeering, a critical distinction that dramatically raised the legal stakes. Under federal law, racketeering murder carries penalties far beyond those imposed by state courts. For Daniel, already serving life sentences, the new charges introduced a terrifying possibility: the death penalty. The federal case transformed his future from grim certainty into existential threat. Cooperation, plea negotiations, and legal strategy suddenly mattered in ways they never had before. The government's theory was blunt. The Aryan Brotherhood functioned as a criminal organization whose survival depended on fear and obedience. Members like Daniel were rewarded for enforcing discipline and punished if they failed. By tying individual acts of violence to the broader enterprise, prosecutors sought not just convictions, but the dismantling of the gang's command structure. Every defendant became a potential link in a chain that could lead higher up the hierarchy. For Daniel, the federal case placed him at the center of two competing forces. On one side was the Aryan Brotherhood, an organization that does not tolerate betrayal and views cooperation with authorities as the ultimate sin. On the other side was the federal government, offering the possibility of avoiding death in exchange for a guilty plea. The calculus was brutal and deeply personal. Loyalty to the gang could mean execution by the state. Cooperation with prosecutors could mean death inside prison. As the case moved forward, the pressure intensified. Evidence accumulated. Witnesses came forward. The narrative of the Scott murder as a racketeering act hardened. For Daniel, the reality became unavoidable. The federal government was prepared to pursue the maximum penalty. The power dynamic that once protected him within the prison system now worked against him. His reputation as an enforcer made him indispensable to prosecutors building their case. Behind closed doors, negotiations began. These discussions were not about innocence or guilt, but about survival. For defendants facing federal capital charges, plea agreements often represent the only path away from execution. In Daniel's case, that path required acknowledging that the murder he committed was not just a killing, but an act carried out to advance the interests of a criminal enterprise. By December 2023, the federal net had tightened completely. Daniel pleaded guilty to murder in aid of racketeering, formally accepting the government's characterization of his role within the Aryan Brotherhood. The plea removed the death penalty from the table, but it did not end his punishment. Instead, it ushered him into a new phase of uncertainty, one defined not by whether he would live or die, but by where and how he would spend the rest of his life. The federal case was hailed by prosecutors as a major blow to the Aryan Brotherhood, but for Daniel, it marked the beginning of another fight. The promise of safety, placement, and protection that often underpins plea agreements would soon become the subject of bitter dispute. As the courtroom doors closed, the conflict shifted back inside the prison system, where power, fear, and survival still ruled. For Brant, 2 scoops. Daniel, the guilty plea entered in December 2023 was not an admission of remorse so much as a calculated act of survival. By pleading guilty to murder in aid of racketeering, he avoided the possibility of a federal death sentence, a penalty the government had made clear it was prepared to pursue. The plea closed one door, but it opened another conflict that would soon dominate the remainder of his life behind bars. Central to that conflict was Daniel's understanding of what the plea agreement promised: According to Daniel and his defense team, the deal was not limited to avoiding execution. They argue it included a critical condition that Daniel would be transferred from the California state prison system into federal custody. For high-ranking prison gang members, placement is not a technicality. It is a matter of life and death. Federal prisons are often viewed by state inmates as safer environments for those who have drawn intense attention or made themselves targets. The population is broader, racial politics are structured differently, and the reach of California-based prison gangs is more limited. For someone like Daniel, known as an Aryan Brotherhood enforcer and now a cooperating defendant in a federal case, remaining in state custody carries extraordinary risk. Despite his plea, Daniel remained housed at California State Prison, Sacramento, commonly known as New Folsom. As months passed without a transfer, frustration turned into legal action. Daniel filed a motion to withdraw his guilty plea, arguing that prosecutors had failed to uphold their end of the agreement. In his view, the plea was entered under false premises. Without the promised transfer, he claimed, the bargain was void. The dispute exposed the fragile trust that underpins plea agreements in high-stakes criminal cases. Prosecutors maintained that the plea had been honored, while Daniel's attorneys argued that the government had leveraged the threat of death to extract a guilty plea without delivering the protections that made it acceptable. The courtroom once again became a battleground. But this time, the fight was not over guilt. It was over custody, control, and survival. Overlaying the legal dispute were alarming allegations about Daniel's treatment inside prison. His lawyers raised concerns that certain corrections officers had harassed and threatened him, and even suggested that staff members may have played roles in orchestrating violence against inmates. These claims painted a picture of a system where the line between authority and abuse was dangerously blurred. Federal prosecutors responded aggressively, rejecting the allegations and countering with accusations of their own. They claimed that Daniel had plotted to murder a corrections officer, an allegation that, if proven, would further justify keeping him in state custody and under the strictest conditions possible. The claims and counterclaims created a narrative of mutual distrust, with each side portraying the other as a threat. Inside the prison, the consequences of this standoff were immediate and severe. Daniel occupied a uniquely dangerous position. To the Aryan Brotherhood, his federal plea risked being interpreted as betrayal. To prison staff, he was portrayed as a manipulative and violent inmate capable of extreme acts. Protection from one side increased hostility from the other. There was no safe alignment. The broader implications of Daniel's case extended beyond a single inmate. It highlighted the unresolved tension between state and federal authority over high-risk prisoners and the limits of plea agreements when custody decisions intersect with institutional politics. It also raised uncomfortable questions about how prison gangs continue to exert influence, even as their members face life sentences and federal prosecutions. As of late 2024, Daniel remained in California, state prison, his future unresolved. The courts had not yet settled whether his plea would stand or be withdrawn. The promised transfer remained disputed, and the threat landscape around him, gang retaliation, institutional conflict, and legal uncertainty, remained unchanged. The story of Brant, 2 scoops. Daniel does not conclude with a sentence or a verdict. It lingers in the spaces between prison walls and courtrooms, where power is contested daily and violence remains a constant undercurrent. His case serves as a stark illustration of how the Aryan Brotherhood's reach extends far beyond individual acts of murder, embedding itself into legal systems, custody battles, and the lives of those caught between loyalty and survival. In the end, Daniel's journey reflects the enduring reality of America's prison gang crisis, that even when justice is formally served, the war does not end. It simply changes location. The story does not end with a guilty plea, nor does it end with a life sentence stacked upon other life sentences. In the world of prison gangs and federal prosecutions, endings are rare. Instead, there are consequences, slow-moving, structural, and often invisible to the outside world. For Brant, 2 scoops. Daniel, the period following his plea marked the beginning of a new role, one shaped less by direct violence and more by what his case represented to everyone watching from inside the system. Within California's prisons, Daniel's case quickly became a point of discussion, not because of sympathy, but because of precedent. Inmate populations pay close attention to what happens when one of their own faces federal charges, pleads guilty, or challenges the government afterward. Each outcome becomes a lesson. Daniel's attempt to withdraw his plea sent a signal that agreements with federal prosecutors are not always final, and that even after cooperation, an inmate can find himself stranded in the most dangerous possible environment. For the Aryan Brotherhood, the implications were equally significant. Federal racketeering cases are designed to fracture organizations by isolating leaders, pressuring enforcers, and forcing individuals to choose between loyalty and survival. Daniel's plea, regardless of its specific terms, reinforced a hard truth for gang leadership. Federal attention changes the rules. Murders ordered from behind bars no longer disappear into institutional silence. They follow paper trails, communications records, and testimony that can unravel decades of control. At the same time, the gang's core logic remained intact. Respect is enforced. Authority is defended. Those perceived as liabilities are dealt with. Even as prosecutions mount, the Aryan Brotherhood adapts, relying on compartmentalization and deniability to survive. Daniel's situation became a cautionary example, proof that visibility brings danger, but invisibility brings irrelevance. Neither offers safety. Beyond gang politics, Daniel's case exposed uncomfortable realities about the American prison system itself. High-risk inmates occupy a gray zone where state and federal authorities overlap, but do not always coordinate. Custody decisions become bargaining chips. Safety assessments collide with institutional pride and liability concerns. When disputes arise, inmates are often left suspended between systems, their well-being secondary to jurisdictional boundaries.